So in this vid, we're taking an absolutely essential step as we develop your ability to enter into the world of AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. What that means right now, as we're in the precursor stage, because obviously we don't have AGI just yet. What we're developing, the precursors, the tools, the methods that will contribute to it. So today we're focusing on APD, Action Perception Divergence, which is an evolution of Friston's active inference. And as we're going to see today, it's actually fairly simple. We're going to do a derivation. That's the whole focus of today. It's all that we're going to do is we're going to go from equation 2 to equation 3. And we're going to have multiple slides. It's going to be a long slide deck. I'll be doing voiceover, not trying to shoot it, in the beautiful natural surroundings of a Hawaii evening. But here's the important thing. As we get through that derivation, and when we get to the end, and as we finally look at the end result and we say to ourselves, that was not such a big deal. The mathematics is fairly straightforward. We'll handle it very easily. And at the end, when we see the equation and we really begin to get at that place where we can start to internalize it, start to really take it into ourselves, and instead of it being sort of floaty in front of our eyeballs, like, ooh, equation, mysterium magicum, take it on down and say, okay, I get what these terms mean. And we will get them so much more, not in this vid, but in following ones, because what we're going to start doing is taking a real model and using it within the context of APD. I'm jumping ahead just a moment here. First of all, if we haven't met before, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Aliana Moran, founder and chief scientist of Themesis Incorporated, founder of the Themesis Academy, your godmother for artificial general intelligence. You know all that by now. Let me just tell you a little tiny bit more because it sets a bit more context for what we've been doing and what we're about to do. And this is it. For the past 10 years, I've been in seclusion, so to speak. I've spent most of my time being adjunct faculty, mostly at Northwestern University. And when I was not grading student papers or coming up with developments for various courses, because I've developed the 3 core courses in artificial intelligence at Northwestern in the Master of Science and Data Science program specifically, their online program. I've been doing this work that has been very, very stealthy, very, very behind the scenes. And not because it's stealthy because we want to be stealthy. It took a really long lead time. I've been working with equations that flat out, they're valid equations. The physicist who developed these equations, this was in the 1950s, 60s time frame. Beautiful theoretical work, very conceptually elegant and useful and interesting. And several people have looked at it since then. There have been applications to other areas, noticeably, and this is like a decade or 2 ago, to things like modeling metal alloys. Hasn't really been used since then. Hasn't been used, and the reason is this. The equations themselves work just fine, but there's not that much that physicists found fascinating because they like sort of more of a grand, global, sweeping statement, and the value of these equations is not in that, but in specific instantiations. When we actually lay out topographies using these equations as our guideline, and then we start doing very specific calculations based on them, that's exciting, that's new, that's radically different, and it presents us with the missing path, the path that we've been needing to move forward with AGI. I'm going to have so much fun sharing this with you. You're going to have so much fun because you're going to go hands-on. Actual code, actual data. It's going to be simple at first, tabletop. Really just like one step, it's going to be a Gedanken experiment, a German word for thought experiment, that we actually get to carry out with a little tiny bit of code and a little tiny bit of data, so it's not just in our heads. There's some numbers, and we're going to use those numbers in the context of APD, Action Perception Divergence. It'll give us a little structure, a little framework. But this is our movement into AGI. And it's not just that we're using APD for this. It's APD indicates how we can modulate control parameters. as we get more and more comfortable, more and more familiar, start taking the, oh my God, look at these fancy equations in the APD sense, and even the fancy equations in the model that I'm about to offer you, not today, next video, you'll say, wow, this is actually kind of not just easy, but fun. Getting hands-on will be the biggest intellectual treat. It'll be Christmas in July. And I'm so looking forward to having that moment with you. But today is a necessary precursor. We go through the equations. I'm going to switch to voiceover. We've got a stack of these things to go through. And by the way, this video, this particular vid, is 5th in the AGI series, being produced in the summer of 2024. And it's the 2nd in the APD series. The predecessor vid introduced APD and got clarity on notation, and an extremely important and vital step. Now we're just going from equations 1 and 2, which are the previous vid, into equation 3. So thank you. Let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, this video is the 2nd in a series on the action perception divergence approach evolved by Hafner et al., originally published in 2020 and revised in 2022. That first prior video in this series focused on clarifying notation that is used in action perception divergence, specifically the probability distribution P sub phi, which expresses the distribution of observations, otherwise being called the random variables. And then we're going to be comparing those, in a Kullback-Leibler sense, against a target distribution tau. Both of these variables, P sub phi and tau, are functions of x and z, where x are the observable variables and z are the latents. Now all of these are used in equation 2, where the authors introduce a reverse Kullback-Leibler divergence, and this is a little bit different from the usual because the multiplying variable, the one that is on top in the logarithmic term and is also multiplying that logarithm, is the actual distribution P sub phi, and typically in a reverse Kullback-Leibler divergence we're using the model as the top term. But this is just a little bit different, and I went into a lot of detail in the previous video going through this. Also, we're going to note that another big difference between the way that this is started is that we're using the joint distribution x and z, whereas often in a variational approach we're having a conditional distribution in the leading equation. Now in today's vid, we're tracing the logic in going from equation 2 to equation 3, which the authors use to show how you can deconstruct the joint KL divergence into two terms. In this case, one is realizing the latent preferences and the other is expressing an information bound. And we're after this particular version for this vid, and we'll hold off on any other versions for later work. But the idea is to set ourselves up so that we can, in the video immediately after this one, not yet done, we can actually use the APD approach, the action perception divergence approach, and get some interesting numbers with which we can play and sort of tease out meaning as we progress. So our starting point is that we're going to recall our knowledge of Bayesian conditional probabilities, and we'll take those two terms, P of x and z and tau of x and z, both of them joint probability distributions, and express each of those as a conditional probability. There's two different ways that we can do each, and we're going to select one of each of them. So we'll select the first of them, P of x and z, and take the latter of the two ways in which we can deconstruct it. We're going to write it as P of z conditioned on x times P of x. By the way, I'm dropping that subscript phi because it's just a little bit of extra work right now. We don't need it as we roll along. We know it's involved. And then we go over to our tau of x and z, the joint probability, and we select the deconstruction of tau of x conditioned on z times tau of z. It's the different deconstruction. So we take those two deconstructions, each of them being a particular and different conditional dependence, and we put them into the original Kullback-Leibler that was of joint distributions. And we notice as we're about to expand out that Kullback-Leibler into its full form, the term that we'll be multiplying, the one that will be in front of the logarithmic term, is the probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x. And of course this will also be on the top within the logarithm. And we notice once again that contrast. On the top, we're going to have the probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x, and on the bottom we'll have tau, or the target, where x is conditioned on z, times the target probability of z. Now for our next step, we expand out this Kullback-Leibler equation, which is now involving two different kinds of conditional probability distributions, whereas the original phraseology was of two joint distributions. And as we expand it out, we notice that it's going to be the expectation, where you have the first term, the probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x, as the multiplier for the logarithmic term. Now for our next step, we use the law of the logarithms of multiplying and dividing terms to expand that into a series of sums and differences of logarithmic terms. And then we do a little bit of grouping. We put together the probability of z conditioned on x and tau of z into one term, and then we put the tau of x conditioned on z and the probability of x into the other. Now let's go back to our original equation 3 so we can get a sense of what we're going to do next. We've taken that original KL divergence, which involves two joint probability distributions, and we're breaking it into two terms. One is the expectation of the Kullback-Leibler for the probability of z conditioned on x compared to the tau of z. So we're looking at what's the likelihood of our latent variables given a certain x compared to the target expectation for those latent variables. And then we're going to subtract from that a different term, one that involves the expectation of a difference between the logarithm of tau on x conditioned on z and the logarithm of the probability of x. So those two terms really involve x, whereas the first term involves z. Now let's give our attention to the first term of these two. We're going to look at the expectation of the Kullback-Leibler of the probability of z conditioned on x compared against tau of z. And just so we can make the correlation when we go back to the term that we're actually working with, we'll note that the multiplier of the logarithm in this, or the expectation of the Kullback-Leibler, would be the probability of z conditioned on x. And when we go over to the term that we're actually working with, we realize that we've got a probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x. But let's think for a moment about what it means that we're using that multiplier of p of x in an expectation, because the two terms within that rightmost term, that difference of the log probability of z conditioned on x and the log of tau of z, neither of those are really dependent on x. We're talking about probabilities of z, or the tau of z, and those are not dependent on the probability of x. So really this expectation is very independent of the probability of x, and we can simply remove that term. When we do this, we realize that we've got our desired result for that first term of equation 3. We've got the expectation of the Kullback-Leibler of the probability of z conditioned on x against tau of z. We've got that. So good. First portion of this derivation is done. We're halfway through achieving our desired result. Let's give our attention now to that second term in equation 3. This is the expectation of a difference between two logarithmic terms, the log of tau of x conditioned on z minus the log of the probability of x. And as we go into that, we'll recognize that the second term in the most recent expansion that we did in the basic Kullback-Leibler divergence was giving us an expectation, same multiplier, probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x, same as we had earlier. Now the two terms that it's multiplying are different. Those are the log of tau of x conditioned on z and the log of probability of x. Very similar. So let's just take a closer look. So the term for our information bound is simple. We simply want the expectation of the difference between the log of tau of x conditioned on z and the log of the probability of x. So let's go back to our starting place, the second term in that Kullback-Leibler expansion that we'd done earlier, and it's the negative, which matches up, expectation of the probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x, multiplying the exact same difference in terms that we desire. That's the log of tau of x conditioned on z minus the log of the probability of x. So we're very close here. All that we need to think through is what that multiplier, probability of z conditioned on x times probability of x, means as we take our expectation in this whole term. So let's take these one by one. Let's start with the log of tau of x conditioned on z. We're talking about a tau, a target, of the x variables, of the observables, as conditioned on z, which of course we won't observe. But given a set of z's, we're going to get a certain value for x, and now let's take a look at what happens when we multiply that by a probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x. They're very independent. The tau of x, as conditioned on z, is independent of a probability of z conditioned on x, being multiplied by p of x, of course. So that multiplier simply doesn't affect the log of tau of x conditioned on z. We can just take it out of that expectation. Similarly, when we take a look at the second term, the log of the probability of x, it is completely independent of the probability of z conditioned on x times the probability of x. That is going to not give us anything that impacts the log probability of x. So once again, we can remove that. That leaves us with a simple expectation of those last two terms with no multiplier, exactly what we desire. So yay, we're done. QED, quod est demonstratum. We've gone from equation 2 to equation 3. Our next step, which we'll pick up in the next video, will be to take a look at how this plays out, what the meaning, what the interpretation of this is. And I know there's this lovely little diagram in the Hafner et al. Paper, but what we really want to do is get an actual data set with this very unusual model that we'll propose. It's a free energy-based model, and we'll actually compute some numbers and plug them in and see how things play out, see what it might actually mean if we were directing action and perception steps within a system. So that's going to be a whole lot of fun. Alrighty, we've just completed that derivation. We can see the first set of fairly cogent APD results for what they are, and this is really kind of interesting, isn't it? And fun and potentially useful. In the next video, we're going to take this into a more hands-on, let me put in some numbers and see what happens kind of thing. And we'll get a sense of feeling, a moving towards what it is that we can do with this method. I'm going to ask some very specific things of you between now and then. 3, in fact, very specific homework assignments. First of all, now that you've gone through the vid, write down equation 2 for yourself. Then, whether you choose to go through the vid and pause at every moment, or just sit down and do it from scratch without even looking at the vid, do the derivation on your own. Go from equation 2 to equation 3. Write it all out. Write out all the little steps that we just went through. Because otherwise, this is sort of, it's in front of our eyeballs, it's floaty, you sitting there, even paying attention, which I trust you are. It's still kind of a passive mode. And to really take it in, internalize, master this thing, you've got to actually engage. And the best engagement is to write the equations down, do the derivations yourself. So that's request number 1. Request number 2. I'm going to invite you to look at the model that we're going to be using. And very specifically, the most recent vid using that model, which actually had data, and it had a little code, and you could take those first steps. Please do that, and then work your way backwards. There's a whole video series on that. There are papers. There's a code repository in GitHub, freely available. There's things that you can do to master this before we get into the actual, even simplest possible application by taking that model into the APD. Third thing, this is perhaps the most important. Reflect on what you know. Go for walking meditations. I'm getting to the point now of encouraging that frequently, especially as we develop more of this I-thou dialogue, and you're hearing me a lot and paying attention, and we're getting deeper into the material. Go for walking meditations, hold the equation in your mind, and consider what it is that we're trying to do and what these things mean, what the specific terms mean. And if you just hold one term in your head for a short walk, that's great. We all start there. But think about the fact that what I'm going to introduce to you as a model is an actual, for real, honest to God, free energy equation. The model itself is a free energy equation, which is massively different from talking about a free energy principle, and what you've got there is a homologue. It is an equation that formally looks like a free energy equation in that you've got something minus an entropy term. Anytime you invoke that entropy term, what you're doing is you're bringing in a minimum. The entropy itself is convex, negative entropy is concave, and when you have a concave function, a nice strong concave function, depends on what values you choose for other parameters, but typically you can drive the system towards a minimum where the essence is defined by that concave negative entropy, and then you're just sort of moving around your minimum someplace within that. That's what people typically do when they're using a free energy principle-like thing, or using a equation within variational inference, active inference, whatever, that looks a lot like and sort of formally behaves like free energy. But it's not really a free energy. I know, I'm on a little bit of a rant here, but this is so important that we collectively understand this, because we're about to move into something that is so exciting, so profound, and so significant for moving AGI forward. But this conceptual understanding is essential. When the actual model is itself a free energy, and what you're doing as part of the whole process, not the whole thing, but part of the whole process is minimizing the free energy. And then what you're doing really is you're having a dialogue between processes. One process is going to allow certain nodes to become active, latent variables within the larger system, not within what we're talking about today. This is going to be inserting what we'll be talking about, not even today, but the next few vids, into a larger architecture where the notions of latent variables will become so supremely important in helping us to connect signal to symbolic. That's the holy grail. That's what we've been wanting out of AI for approximately 50 years. And we're finally going to have that. But to do that, we need this system where you're not only introducing some latent variables that are going to be active as part of this process, signal up to symbolic, but we govern the activation of those latent variables with free energy minimization. Two processes going on, not necessarily simultaneously, but in dialogue with each other. You use one, then the other, and you keep balancing the two out. Radically new, totally different, going to be a lot of fun, but it's going to be also a different new toy. So I'm so looking forward to having that moment with you. It's going to be very soon, I promise you. For today, number one, derive the equation on your own, just so you really feel that comfortableness with it. Number two, go get that video that I'm going to show you and crack it open. Get that code. It's simple. It's easy. All you have to do is import code into your favorite Python idle, hit the run button. No data directories that you've got to install. You just hit that button, run, and listen to the video, because it's a step-by-step walkthrough of what to do. But there'll be very simple steps to take. Start working your way backward. From that moment, start reviewing the earlier videos, start reading the blog posts. Of course, the blog posts are always found by accessing the description box below. Pay particular attention to the code walkthrough videos. You may want to spend an evening just sitting down with that code. There are subtleties there, okay? And by the way, we are using the simplest possible version of this method. It's called the cluster variation method. We're using the one-dimensional version, which is a single zigzag chain, instead of a two-dimensional version. We're using a one-parameter version instead of a two-parameter version, keeping it as simple as we possibly can, just so we can get a feeling for how this thing works, and we'll gradually expand the complexity of what we're doing. And there are subtleties, believe me, we want to get into them. But do that, and then start to reflect thoughtfully, carefully on what it is that we're doing as we introduce a free energy model, an honest to God free energy equation as our model that we take to a minimum in our process, as opposed to just sort of generically talking about a free energy process. World of difference. And a great deal of power is going to come to you as you begin to master playing with this new toy. So thank you. It's been lovely to have this moment with you. Once again, Aliana Maren from Themesis. Have a lovely day. We'll see you soon. And just as a follow-up note, please visit our website at themesis.com. Go to the About page, scroll down, find that opt-in form, fill it in, Click on the confirmation emails and move the emails that you get from us to your preferred folder because we offer all sorts of goodies. We let you know when videos have been produced, as well as blog posts. The two tend to accompany each other, but there's always extra blog posts on pertinent topics where we don't have time to make a vid. And also we create special offers for our courses or other opportunities to be with us. So please get on our list and become part of the Themesis community. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you soon. Have a lovely day.